Good evening and welcome to the Courtauld Institute, at least in its virtual existence. I do hope you can all hear me. I trust Fern will let me know if you can't. My name is Scott Nethersole and I'm hosting this evening's Renaissance seminar. For those of you who normally follow the seminar will know that we have 2 or 3 meetings a term, but that at the moment we cut that down to only a single meeting for obvious reasons. But there are other speakers that will be coming up in the next few terms, including Edward Payne, who will be talking in the spring term from the University of Aarhus in Denmark. He'll be talking to us about his recent research. And Vincent Deliver, who's the curator of Italian paintings before 1800 at the Louvre, will be talking to us about Leonardo and his experiences of the recent exhibition in Paris. Can I also remind you about a conference that will start next month entitled Travelling Objects, Travelling People, Art and Artists in Late Medieval and Renaissance Iberia and Beyond, 1400 to 1550, which will be on the 10th and 11th of December, and for which you can find details on the Research Forum website. But on to the business of this evening, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Nelson and to welcome him back to the Courtauld. Jonathan is a teaching professor at Syracuse University at Seton in Florence. He's also a research associate of the Harvard Kennedy School and was formerly the assistant director of academic programs at Villa Itati, the Harvard Center for the Study of the Italian Renaissance in Florence. He will be known to many of you as a specialist in Florentine art of the 15th century, and particularly in the art of Filipino Lippi, about which he's going to talk to us this evening. He's published, together with Patrizia Zambrano, the definitive monograph on the subject in 2004, and is again working on Filipino for a book with reaction, which is due out in the next few years. He'll also be known to you through a whole plethora of publications, but other books, including The Patron's Payoff, which he co-wrote with the economist Richard Zeckhauser, which reminds me of Jonathan's particular ability to pair up and write together with other people. And particularly in that spirit, he is also, there's a edited volume is about to come out on representing infirmity in Renaissance Italy, which has been co-edited between Jonathan and John Henderson and Frederica Jacobs, in which he has a paper on cancer in Michelangelo's Night. For those of you, again, who follow the seminar will recognize that it was a paper he gave to us several years ago. Jonathan is, of course, also known for some of the exhibitions that he has co-curated. He was involved with, particularly relevant for this evening, the exhibition at the Palazzo Strozzi, well, over a decade ago now, on Botticelli and Filippino. He's also been involved in exhibitions on Michelangelo and Mapplethorpe, separately, that is to say, at the Accademia. And this evening, he's going to talk to us about Ethiopian Christians in Florence, Filipino Lippi's Adoration of the Magi, and Miracle of St. Philip. Before I hand over to him, he's asked me to remind you that this is unpublished research and to entreat you, therefore, not to record it or take any screenshots. There will be, and we hope there will be, a lively discussion at the end, and I'll give you details at the end of Jonathan's presentation about how you can put questions to him. For the moment, over to Jonathan.
Hello. Thank you, Scott, for your introduction and for the invitation to return here to the Renaissance Forum. One of the reasons I accepted your kind invitation was because of the great feedback I received last time I spoke, and I hope to get that again. I'm developing this material into an article, so I'd be most grateful for any comments, either during the discussion or via email. Let me say that the inspiration for this talk began with an article which I assigned to my students by Sarah Bond about the pigmentation of ancient statuary. My students are struck by the fact that only 2% of classics faculty are minorities, but the statistics are no better for Italian Renaissance art history. Bond argues that if we want to see more diversity in classics, we have to work harder as public historians to emphasize the vast palette of skin tones in the ancient Mediterranean. I think much the same holds true for Quattrocento, Italy. So while I began by choosing a topic that I thought would be meaningful for students, I discovered that this enriched the meaning of the works themselves, at least for me, and I hope you agree. Many 15th century Florentine paintings depict Black figures as men with low social status. Occasionally, such as Biagio Antonio's representation of a tormentor here on the screen, they are negative, clearly negative roles. But most often, Black figures appear as servants, especially after the first documented arrival in Florence of enslaved Africans in 1461. Filipino's Strozzi Madonna can serve as a typical example. The tiny Black figures in the background were probably inspired by the patron's household. In his 1491 will, Filippo Strozzi mentioned that upon his death, freedom should be granted to Giovanni, an enslaved Black man. African attendants appear in many Tuscan depictions of the Adoration of the Magi, such as this fresco by Fra Angelico, but this follows a long tradition dating back to Nicola Pisano and his pulpit. Though Black Magi appear in several North Italian paintings already in the 1460s, and it became ubiquitous in Netherlandish and German works, the first major example on public view in Florence comes much later, Andrea del Sarto's 1511 Procession of the Magi. In his unsurpassed analysis of the rise of the Black Magus in Western art, Paul Kaplan briefly considered the reasons for the absence of Black kings in Florence. Well, today I'd like to flip the question and explore some late 15th century religious paintings where Blacks do appear and are shown with great dignity and importance. These works, I suggest, indicate that Black lives mattered in Renaissance Florence, but only insofar as they evinced the global reach of Christianity. At least 4 Florentine works from the mid to late 1490s represent a significant change from the familiar images of Black servants and pages. A remarkable altarpiece depicting the coronation of the Virgin, attributed to Davide Ghirlandaio, includes a Black donor. And technical analysis has shown that the painting has not been cut off. As noted by Kate Lowe, this work provides very exciting evidence of Black assimilation to or appropriation of religious and cultural Italian Renaissance norms. I suspect that the donor was a freed African who had converted to Christianity, and the city depicted in the background is Florence, so that's probably where he lived. A tondo, usually attributed to Raffaello Botticini, is the first known Florentine adoration to show Black Magus, albeit by a very minor master, and a smallish work, surely made for private residence. Today, my talk is going to focus on new interpretations of 2 major works by Filippino, which were painted when he was the leading artist in Florence, but they're barely mentioned in the growing literature on Renaissance Italian images of Blacks. The prominent figure in his Adoration, neither a king nor a page, represents the first Gentile who accepted Christ, as discussed in St. Augustine's Epiphany sermons. The dignified Black man in Filipino's Miracle of St. Philip fresco in the Strozzi Chapel in Santa Maria Novella evidently represents, or at least alludes to, the Ethiopian eunuch baptized by St. Philip, or so I will argue. Each of these four paintings thus show Black Africans as recent or future Christian converts. This hitherto unnoticed phenomenon reflects, I suggest, an increased awareness of African Christians. These co-religionists are rarely discussed in studies about images of Blacks in Renaissance Europe, which focus on servants, slaves, and legendary kings. In the Quattrocento, however, at least 19 Ethiopian delegations reached Western Europe. A few paintings by Tuscan artists reflect the encounters between African Christians and the Pope himself in 1441 and especially 1481. So we can begin today by considering some recent studies about how African Christians were seen by Europeans in the 15th century. A word on terminology. Africans in this talk refers to sub-Saharans, and though their wide range of skin tones was acknowledged in a few Renaissance sources, most describe them as Black. Confusingly, several authors also used Moor for both North and Sub-Saharan Africans. According to many ancient and medieval texts, Black Africans came from a place called Ethiopia, which was a generic term for the world south of Europe. This often indicated the ends of the earth, to quote from the biblical book of Acts, or else what the ancient author Strabo considered the far extremities of the inhabited world. By the mid-Quattrocento, however, Europeans generally understood Ethiopians to mean Christian subjects of the Ethiopian king, who was known in the West as Prester John. For centuries, stories circulated about this Christian ruler of immense wealth and influence. Often, Prester John's subjects were identified with St. Thomas Christians in India, and thus many texts refer to Ethiopians as Indians. This predella panel at the Courtauld, which depicts the missionary activity of Thomas the Apostle, painted by the Lucchese artist Vincenzo Frediani, seems to indicate the Indians primarily by their skin tone, and they can easily be confused with North or Sub-Saharan Africans. And speaking of Indians and Blacks, I can't help tipping my hat to Vice President-elect Harris. Florentines actually met several Ethiopians at the 1441 Council, convened by Pope Eugene IV in his attempt to unify the various Eastern churches. In this image from the doors of St. Peter's, Filarete depicts the arrival of the delegation in Rome. The four monks declare that their ruler, who Europeans called Prester John, dominated over 100 kings, each with a realm larger than Europe. No one doubted that John could help fight against the Muslims. This belief led several popes to seek out the Ethiopian ruler. They sent letters to him. They sent delegates to him. He was even thought to be a descendant of one of the three Magi, according to John of Hildesheim's highly influential book about the Epiphany. This account was confirmed by the first official Ethiopian delegation in Europe in 1404. Soon after, and across much of Europe, Black kings began to appear in adoration of the Magi paintings. The Bible specifically mentioned Ethiopia in a different story about Philip's baptism of the eunuch. This event, of exceptional significance for African and European Christians, was also well known in Florence. In this city, the presence of a celebrated relic of Philip gave his feast day the same status as those of the city's patron saints. According to Acts, and I translate from a 1490 Italian Bible, an angel told Philip to go to Jerusalem, and on a desert road, he encountered a eunuch, a powerful baron of Candace, queen of Ethiopia, who was minister of all her riches. He had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and while returning in his chariot, he read the book of Isaiah. It goes on to say Philip joined the eunuch in his chariot and then baptized him. At the 1441 council, the Ethiopian monks proudly mentioned the origins of their church. Their discourse was translated immediately into Italian, allowing Florentines the extraordinary experience of hearing from Ethiopians that the biblical eunuch came from their own country. For Eusebius, the eunuch held great importance as the first pagan to convert to Christianity. The church historian had conflated Philip the deacon, who baptized the eunuch, with Philip the apostle. And this identification was followed not by the church today, but by most medieval and Renaissance authors, although not by Jacobus de Voragine, whose 13th century golden legend became the standard source for holy images. The Ethiopian in the golden legend, who's best known to art historians, is seen here being dug up in a church cemetery by Saints Cosmas and Damian. When the Sienese painter, Sana di Pietro, depicted the scene in the 1450s, he signaled the black man's religion by depicting a man of sorrows in a lunette on a nearby wall. For Leonard Barkin, the Ethiopian represented a kind of distant, lost tribe of Christianity. Well, this might describe Jacobus's understanding of Ethiopians, but by the time Sano painted his work, Florentines had already welcomed Ethiopians into Tuscany. From members of a lost tribe, these African Christians had become honored guests. The very presence of these co-religionists from a distant land must have astonished Italians. They made a very positive impact, perhaps comparable to the negative one proposed for an earlier period by Madeleine Canavis. One reason that European Christians had come to regard themselves as white by 1250, she wrote, may be that they had been coming in contact with large numbers of brown infidels. 2 centuries later, visiting Ethiopians provided the living proof that Christianity had reached the ends of the earth. These visitors also undermined many stereotypes about Africans. Earlier texts often described them as powerful giants, though in the 14th century, one source claimed that Ethiopians were short and fat, with thick lips and flat noses. In striking contrast, an anonymous Florentine observer in 1441, when he described the African monks, said that they were black and skinny, not fat, and very weak. In a similar vein, when Brocchi returned from Ethiopia in 1483, he described the inhabitants there as ugly and weak, but zealously religious and fervent in spirit more than all other Christians. Very recent studies on modern views about race have explored the lasting impact of medieval texts and images. In particular, the traditional associations between black and evil and beliefs about the supposed inferiority of Africans. In the Quattro and early Cinquecento, however, Matteo Salvadore has recently argued that faith trumped color in encounters between European and Ethiopian Christians. African pilgrims and official representatives, he argued, were always treated in ways comparable to those enjoyed by their European counterparts. Other historians have critiqued but largely followed this position. Nevertheless, as Samantha Kelly has noted, many contemporaries criticized Ethiopian Christians for observing Old Testament customs, especially circumcision. In the 1480s, the Venetian friar Francesco Suriani even stated that the Ethiopian Christians were heretics. Paintings from this period provide additional primary evidence about how the Africans were seen, quite literally, in the Quattrocento. An important but little known example appears in the celebrated frescoes in the side walls of the Sistine Chapel. Marco Bonecchi convincingly argued that 4 dark-skinned figures reflect the Ethiopian embassy which arrived in Rome in November 1481. 2 each appear near Moses in Botticelli's Youth of Moses and in Biagio's Crossing of the Red Sea. The monks remained for 3 months as guests of Pope Sixtus IV during the very period when the Florentines painted his chapel. The white shawl depicted by Botticelli has been recognized as similar to the samma worn by Christian Ethiopians of all social classes, then and now. In the frescoes, the individualized features suggest that they are portraits, like the numerous others in the Sistine Chapel scenes from both the lives of Christ and Moses. Many contemporaries mentioned the joy of Sixtus in welcoming the Ethiopians and the many honors he bestowed upon them. The Pope dined with the monks. He granted them privileged positions in processions and masses, and he gave them valuable gifts. And documents from the time mention this. So the depictions of Ethiopians in the Pope's chapel must also reflect his delight about his African visitors. These frescoes also established an important precedent for Botticelli's student, Filippino. He too would later depict Africans with great respect, although not, I think, as equals to Europeans. Filipino's altarpiece, signed and dated 1496, represents a significant development in the history of Black figures in adoration paintings. One noteworthy example, in the convent of San Marco, adorned the very cell where Pope Eugene had resided during the Council of 1441. The Black attendant in this fresco, a small figure, might reflect the Pope's interest in Ethiopia, as many scholars have suggested. Nevertheless, as Paul Kaplan noted, this work reveals the difficulty of sustaining a direct link between the events of the council and the Black Magus. For if such a link existed, this is surely the image in which it would be visible. Looking beyond Florence, I realized that Black kings appear in the art of Lombardy and Northern Europe, where official Ethiopian delegates never arrived. But they don't appear in any 15th century image from Naples, Venice, Rome, or Florence, this city that hosted such embassies. The Ethiopian ruler himself never came to Europe, and perhaps that made all the difference. A half century after the Council of Florence, several Florentine painters started depicting a Black Magus. Some earlier reported examples turned out to be false positives. Here's one by Pezzolino. But as you could see, that after it went under conservation work, the Black Magus simply disappeared. The same happened with this painting of Biagio d'Antonio. In both cases, it turns out that a modern restorer, if that's the right term, had blackened one of the kings. And I found a couple of other examples as well. On the other hand, the African Magus in this adoration is original and dates from the mid to late 1490s. Filipino's painting is contemporary, and while neither work shows the impact of the other, both reveal the fascination with depicting Africans at the end of the century. Local politics indicate that Filipino must have begun his painting after November 1494, when Florentines had banished the head of state, Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici, and welcomed the French king, Charles VIII. This royal procession was led by Piero's cousin, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, whose features are identifiable in Filipino's youngest king, dressed in red. He stands next to his brother, Giovanni, who is depicted as a page. Nearby, another portrait is a portly man holding an astrolabe in the lower left, and he was identified by Vasari as Pierfrancesco, the father of Lorenzo and Giovanni. When the Augustine convent of San Donato a Scopeto commissioned Filipino's works, the canons evidently requested these three portraits to curry favor with the newly empowered younger branch of the Medici family. Vasari praised the Moors and Indians in strangely decorated attire, evidently referring to the half-dozen figures on the far right and some in the background. These figures wear colorful turbans, and the dark-skinned man in the foreground sports a gold earring and a pearl. Scholars have described him as black, and rightly so, although his hair, skin tone, and facial features may remind modern viewers of North Africans. Still, when Vasari described three other paintings by various artists, including this one, he repeatedly used the term Moors together with Indians, and each work includes one man who is clearly depicted as a Black African. In these works, Vasari evidently wanted to indicate people with dark skin from an imprecisely defined area south of Europe, a description which also applies to Filipinos' strangely dressed Moors and Indians. The black man wears an earring, a detail also often found in Renaissance depictions to indicate the other, although early sources don't mention Africans wearing this jewelry. Perhaps Filipino had heard some fabulous tales about Ethiopian riches and used them to create a figure that expressed not only alterity, but wealth. Now, to understand how Filipino's altarpiece would have been interpreted by its intended audience, the Augustinian canons, we can follow Antonio Natali's suggestion and consider Augustine's Epiphany sermons. The man behind Joseph, with a domed cap, who looks to the side and wears a money belt prominently on his belt, probably refers to Augustine's condemnation of the Jews who turned away from divine revelation. The enlightenment of the Magi, he said, bears deliberate witness to the blindness of the Jews. In another sermon, Augustine paid tribute to three Magi, whom faith led to Christ from distant regions. Now people are coming from the ends of the earth, from the east, and the west and the north and the south. To represent these figures from the south, and perhaps also from the east, Filipino showed one man with a blue turban with his hands joined in prayer, looking toward the Christ child. Closer to the viewer, both his companion in a yellow turban and the black man appear solemn and dignified. Building on Natalia's thesis, I think Filipinos' patrons understood this black figure in light of Augustine's commentary on Psalm 73. He unequivocally stated that the Ethiopian people mentioned in the psalm should be interpreted as all Gentiles, and fittingly by people who are black, for the Ethiopians are black. These people who were black are the very ones who are called to faith. In early Christian writings, biblical references to Ethiopians, especially in Psalms 67 and 73, led to two main interpretive strategies. Ethiopians could indicate sinners, or, as in Augustine, it represents Gentiles. In contrast to the many images where black figures served as metaphors for evil, the representations of Moors and Indians in Filipino's altarpiece represents the more positive and Augustinian understanding of black-skinned Gentiles. The inclusion of these figures, together with the Jewish man and the Medici portraits, strongly indicate that Filipinos' patrons provided the artist with specific indications. Earlier paintings made for Augustinian churches in Tuscany do not include black figures. The motivation for the bold decision to show the black figure and to show him as first among the Gentiles may well lie in the growing awareness of Christian Africans in the late Quattrocento. Nevertheless, Filipino does not suggest any equality between the black and white figures in his altarpiece. Original viewers could probably recognize and identify with the prominent European in the right foreground, whose distinctive features also appear in Filipino's Strozzi Chapel fresco. I wish I knew who he was, but Filipino's audience surely knew who he was. And he must have been a leading Florentine who quite literally shows the way to the black-skinned figures standing behind him. In the 15th century, the most prominent depiction of an African figure appears in the Miracle of St. Philip. A series of visual signs indicate the importance of this handsome individual, seemingly drawn from life. One of the only figures not overlapped by others, he stands near the right edge in front of a fictive pier, and thus close to observers at the Strozzi Chapel entrance. With his erect posture and prominent headgear, the black man towers over most figures. His gold and pearl earring and his gold-fringed shawl, together with the jewels on his hat and his sash, make him the most richly dressed personage in the entire chapel. Who is he? Well, to establish his identity and significance, we must consider the broader context of the fresco decorations. Though contracted in 1487, progress was delayed for years by another commission. In 1488, Filipino went to Rome to paint the Carapa Chapel. He began painting the Strozzi fresco only in 1494, after the death of the patron, when the artist definitively returned to Florence. On the right-hand wall, Filipino depicted the only two stories about Philip mentioned in the Golden Legend. The opposite wall shows thematically related scenes about St. John the Evangelist. In this lunette, Filipino depicted the failed attempt to execute St. John in a pot of boiling oil. In the right lunette, the crucifixion of Philip in the Anatolian city of Hierapolis. The main scene on the left shows the raising of Drusiana, which is signed and dated 1502. This shows St. John when he stopped the funeral of one of his followers, Drusiana, and brought her back to life. This resurrection theme is picked up in the scene on the right wall, the miracle of St. Philip. The Golden Legend recounts that the saint was forced to pray before a statue of Mars in the Central Eurasian region of Scythia. From under the idol, a dragon came forth and killed 3 people, including the priest's son. Philip promised to resurrect them if the pagans would destroy their statue, then set up and worship a Christian cross. After they agreed, he banished the dragon, and this is the moment shown by Filippino. Nearly all the figures gesticulate or grimace to show their horror or amazement, but the black figure maintains a noble reserve. Mars still appears menacing and the boy dead because the conversion of the pagans has yet to take place. Recent studies provide crucial information about the clothing in this scene, which helps establish the dating and meaning. The black man's shawl has been identified as a sama decorated with a gold fringe, prompting the convincing description of the figure as a Ethiopian, a worldly man of high social status. Filippino shows the sama as thrown over the man's shoulder, with more of the cloth bunched under his hands. Significantly, the only other Italian image to include a sama-like shawl are the Ethiopian men in Botticelli's Youth of Moses. When in Rome, Filippino could have seen this fresco, must have seen this fresco, as well as members of the local Ethiopian community. If these monks and pilgrims did not have Western clothes, they would have worn a sama. Though, of course, the gold harness and sash and earring in the fresco are all fruit of Filippino's imagination. Filippino also gave the black man a zamt, the shaggy red hat worn by high Mamluk officials, though in reality this never included a strip of jewels. Filippino could have studied this hat when an official Mamluk embassy visited Florence in 1487, an event famous for the Sultan's gift of a giraffe to Lorenzo the Magnificent, or else a little-known embassy of 1497. The headpiece appears in many Venetian paintings from this period, not only on Mamluks, but also on black figures. In Florence, Africans wearing the zamt appear in some paintings by Vasari, which is where they have been identified as Mamluk soldiers, leading to the same identification of Filipino's figure. But it seems unlikely that Filipino shows a soldier. Although black soldiers did join the Mamluk musket unit, the Sultan gave the black chief the right and honor to wear the zamt only in 1498. Presumably, other black soldiers followed his lead, and the word traveled to Italy, where at a later date, a few years later, the headgear became the generic sign of blackness in Italian art. Though several of the pagans wear turbans, one man, behind the figure supporting the priest's son, supports a very unusual variation. This turban has 2 side projections that resemble the horned headgear found in Flemish paintings and depicted by Filippino's workshop in his Moses Striking the Rock. An article in the current Burlington magazine argues that this blue headgear depicts the new horned turban worn by the Mamluk elite starting in 1496, which Filipino could have observed when their embassy reached Florence. I think that's generally correct, although I'm not so sure that Filipino literally saw this headgear. The early 16th century examples and descriptions indicate that two protrusions really did look like horns, but they don't in Filipino's version. Most likely, the artist had only heard about the new turban, or perhaps he saw a drawing. Nevertheless, the main point is that the combination of this headgear and the zamt suggests that Filipino painted his scene in the late 1490s. The author suggested that the Mamluk costumes served as a generic reference to the otherness of the pagans. A generic reference to the Ethiopian setting. And certainly, the turbans allowed Filipino to emphasize the otherness of the pagans and indulge in his taste for the new and exotic. In addition, the decision to include an African probably relates to a very different medieval tradition of depicting the Pentecost with a black figure, in order to indicate the conversion of peoples from different lands. Filipino must have seen this example in the very same church of Santa Maria Novella. But all of these factors do not fully explain why Filipino depicted the black man in a sama and with such riches and dignity and prominence. It's also been suggested years ago that the black man portrays Giovanni, the enslaved African who is mentioned in Strozzi's 1491 will. But none of the figures in the Strozzi Chapel have the highly individualized features that are found in Filipino's secure portraits, such as those in the Carafa Chapel, or the others that we've already seen in the Adoration of the Magi. We know what a Filipino portrait looks like, and we don't find any of them in the Strozzi Chapel. Moreover, the Ethiopian in the Strozzi Chapel does not wear contemporary attire. So even if an enslaved African served as Filipino's model, we still have to figure out what role the figure plays within the logic of the scene. For 15th century Florentines, the most obvious association between a black man and St. Philip was the most important event in the life of the saint. As suggested to me in an email by Paul Kaplan, who gave me enormous assistance in my research for this paper, a key figure that may lie behind the St. Philip fresco is that it was Philip who baptized the black eunuch of the Queen of Ethiopia. In the same way, I suggest, the figure perfectly complements Filipino's message about conversion. Moreover, this baptism story was familiar to the many Italians who visited Jerusalem in the 15th century, who noted in their writings the very spot where Philip encountered the Ethiopian eunuch. Also, on at least 5 occasions, the Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola made brief references to the eunuch in the 1490s. Significantly, Savonarola never felt the need to recount the story itself. Obviously, he knew that his audience was familiar with it. When Filippo Strozzi decided to devote a wall of his chapel to his patron saint, which is a rare subject in Tuscan painting, he might have requested the inclusion of the eunuch. But in that case, he could have just asked for a depiction of the baptism. I think it's more likely that the artist himself came up with the novel idea. Filipino must have known about the celebrated encounter between his own name saint and the eunuch. During his Roman sojourn, he had ample opportunity to see Ethiopians painted by Botticelli, as well as Ethiopian pilgrims in the city. And so Filippino might well have decided to add one to the scene. Although Florentines had heard of the Ethiopian eunuch, he had not been depicted in Italian art since the Byzantine period. Even in the Cinquecento, the eunuch appears very rarely in Italian art. In these works, and in many Northern European images, you might be familiar with Rembrandt's, you might be surprised to see the castrated man is bearded. Well, the original observers evidently felt that facial hair, which is a typical attribute of mature men, would be appropriate for a court treasurer. The slight beard on the Ethiopian in Filipino's miracle does not preclude his identification as the eunuch. Each of these scenes present the eunuch as co-protagonist. In Filipino's miracle, however, the black figure looks on from the side at an event in which he did not participate. His role recalls that of apostles that appear in innumerable paintings of the crucifixion and deposition. Not only were Renaissance viewers familiar with such anachronisms, if we should call it that, but texts about Philip did not clarify the chronological sequence of the miracle and the baptism. If visitors to the Strozzi Chapel saw or heard that the black man represented the eunuch, they could have associated the abundance of gold and jewels on his clothing with his role as court treasurer. The prominence and noble bearing of this figure would be consistent with his high status in the court of Queen Candace. This might also help explain the surprising decision to show the black figure with his arms. During the Mamluk embassies in Florence, Filippino probably saw the zamt worn by high officials, the only ones who were allowed to wear it. Italians certainly knew that many Ethiopian eunuchs were in the Mamluk court, and if any had joined the embassies to Florence, they surely would have been noticed. Moreover, some Florentine merchants surely knew that Ethiopian eunuchs had served as court treasurers. Now, it'd be great for my argument if Filippino knew that, but we have no way of establishing that. Still, when Filippino had to create a new iconography for the treasurer of the Ethiopian queen, he had good reason to deck him with jewels and to give him an opulent version of the exotic headgear then worn by court eunuchs, just as he had given him a gold-fringed sama. Directly across from the Ethiopian, Filippino painted another figure who might depict a eunuch. The raising of Drusiana takes place in Ephesus, famous for its round temple of Diana, which Filippino depicted in the background. Drusiana, a follower of John, was to receive a Christian burial, but Filippino, against all logic and established iconography, depicted a pagan procession led by an old man. Why would he do this? I suggest this reflects Pliny's reference to a painting by Apelles that depicted the procession of the priest of Diana at Ephesus. This passage was noted by Poliziano, who could have read in Strabo that this priest was a eunuch. So perhaps, a scholar suggested to Filippino that in the Strozzi Chapel, across from the Christian eunuch, he depicted an ancient one, although my argument does not rest on this point. These figures, standing in front of entrance piers, present a striking contrast. On the left, the pagan priest of Diana moves away from St. John. On the right, the Ethiopian eunuch turns toward Philip. Standing outside the chapel, Florentines would have witnessed the miracle of St. Philip by following the gaze of the African. In this way, he recalls a standard compositional figure in 15th century paintings, defined by Alberti as the festaiolo. By giving the Black figure a marginal role, yet one of great visibility and importance, Filipino's fresco offers a visual parallel to the way the eunuch is presented in the Book of Acts. His designation there as a eunuch has attracted the attention of recent biblical scholars, who emphasize the scorn shown for castrated men by Greek, Roman, and Jewish authors. Not only does the Ethiopian eunuch cross boundaries between male and female, observed Brittany Wilson, but he comes from a land that lies on the border of the civilized world and greets Philip on the borders of civilization itself. Gay Byron takes a very different approach, but she too concluded that the biblical text served, quote, to demonstrate that Christianity could extend to cultural and political outsiders, end quote. The biblical eunuch and the 15th century Ethiopian pilgrims were Christians and thus insiders, but they stood outside the social sphere of Italians. This transpires from a fascinating quote by Antonio de Ferraris, known as Galateo. His treatise on nobility from the 1490s states that Philip marked for holy baptism the servant of the Ethiopian queen, Candace, and he did not object because the servant was an Ethiopian and a eunuch. By implication, some people who were less honorable than Philip would object to the Ethiopian's sexual status and his origins. The tension between inclusion and exclusion, which permeates Acts and later religious commentaries, recalls some of the 15th century reactions to Ethiopians. These Africans were welcomed because they were Christians, even though they looked weak and followed some questionable religious rituals. Filipino presents the Ethiopian as a marginal figure, both literally and symbolically. He stands at the edge of the miracle scene, in a liminal space between viewer and saint. The decision to include this African observer and show him so prominently reflects not only the great interest in the late Quattrocento in Ethiopia, but also, and more specifically, the dramatic increase in contact with Black Christians. Many Italians must have seen these Ethiopians as, yes, part of their same religious community, but very different from themselves, as both insiders and outsiders. Of course, it's not so very different today if we consider contemporary reactions to African visitors. The Black figure in the Strozzi Chapel thus gives us an opportunity to reflect on how Africans were seen in Filipinos' day and in our own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Can you take the image down? Fantastic. We now, thank you for such a rich presentation. It's given us a huge amount to think about. And just to say from the very outset how convincing the identification of that figure is with the Ethiopian eunuch. But before I jump in with my questions, I want to say that there are two ways of asking questions or engaging in dialogue. The first is to put questions into the chat, and I will read them out on your behalf, or to raise your hand in the chat or just put a Q or I have a question in the chat, and we will unmute you and allow you to speak your question directly. The latter, I should say, can be a lot nicer for the speaker to actually hear your voice, and it's a lot better if you imagine there's going to be some to and froing. But either way is fine. But while we wait for you and give you the opportunity to think of your questions, I want to start by asking, well, I have a lot I want to ask. I mean, I particularly interested in in whether or not we can associate dignity with figures that are exoticized, but that's a different thing for the moment. The first thing I want to start with is our questions around gender, I suppose. That, I mean, all in large part, the sub-Saharan Africans that you've shown and that we do see in Florentine art in the second half of the 15th century are male. And yet a lot of the works that historians have done on the period and about changes in populations has focused on arrival, particularly of, from the 1460s onwards, of female enslaved women who are, so female slaves who are largely doing domestic work. Whereas you have emphasized very much the relationship between the kind of Ethiopian embassies with the arrival of pilgrims, in which I think there's been, at least from what I can see, less historical work, or at least on the flow of pilgrims, I suppose. And so my question is, one, is that right? And second of all, does the presence of female sub-Saharan slaves in Florence leave sort of very little visual trace? I mean, is it really the male pilgrims that are, in a sense, leaving some kind of trace visually in the second half of the century?
Well, actually, Pat Simons, who may be listening in, gave a talk recently on images of Black women in Italian Renaissance art. And as she pointed out to me the other day, that Filipino's Strozzi Madonna shows not only the two male figures, which I showed in my detail, but also there's another apparently female figure who's a servant. And there are a number of other works that show female Black figures. So they do exist. I mean, I didn't discuss them because it wasn't related to the topic of my paper. All the Christian Ethiopians that came to Italy were male. That is, we have monks. We don't have nuns, and therefore I was emphasizing the male figures. But the female figures do have a presence in Italian Renaissance art, much less, but they do have a presence.
Okay, so are we having some questions that's going to come through on the chat? Guido Rebecchini writes, Jonathan, do you think the position of the hands carries religious meaning? You might have to clarify which hands, or is it clear to you?
I suppose he means the gesture of the figure in the Strozzi Chapel who's holding his cloth to his body. I don't know. I mean, if it is a ritual, if it is has religious meaning, I don't know what that meaning is.
He's just added a comment in saying the joined hands of the eunuch is what he's, yeah,
right.
Exactly as you say.
But I've been fortunate in having an enormous amount of assistance from a number of Ethiopian specialists, especially Samantha Kelly, but many others. And I will send the question to them to see whether this hand gesture has any known meaning, but not that I know. Thanks for the question.
I mean, I suppose the question is probably coming up from the kind of work that Bill Hood did on kind of gestures at San Marco. But again, it would be complicated whether or not those gestures read for a Western audience or if they're ones that are taken from Ethiopian gestures, as it were.
Well, I mean, as an attempt, looking at Catholic or Dominican gestures that, like Bill Hood suggested, I don't see any particular significance in the gesture. So
we have a question from Jane Cooper, who says, do you think that the arguments that the figure with the Magus in the San Donato altarpiece is the donor Piero da Pugliese? And the interesting thing for me is that these two men look as if they were exchanging views, almost like the double portrait that Lippi painted of himself and del Pugliese.
So the figure is often identified as Piero del Pugliese, although, so we're in the Adoration of the Magi on the right, the prominent Florentine, the leading figure. I don't think it's actually Piero del Pugliese because we have secure portraits of him and he looks quite different. And he's a different age. But whoever he is, there certainly does seem to be a dialogue between the two. And it's an interesting parallel that you're making between the double portrait of Filippino and Piero del Pugliese, which is a painting in Denver, And in both cases, the figure on the right and further back is not being shown as a social equal. That is, the artist in the double portrait is showing himself in profile and further back, giving more prominence to the patron. And in this case, certainly the white figure, the Italian, is standing in the foreground. And as I suggest, he's indicating the way, leading the way, telling the African figure where to go. So in both cases, yes, there is a dialogue. And in both cases, we see how the artist shows status. And that gets back to your question, Scott. And others have mentioned this to me, whether we could talk about dignity and it's a difficult point, but I think it's our job as art historians trying to read works of art from the past. I mean, if we can't read hierarchy from a work of art, there's a problem there. I mean, artists were obviously, artists and viewers felt very strongly about hierarchy. It was in all aspects of the society. We see it in works of art. And I think that it's not only a legitimate but important objective of our studies to try to analyze that. And so it seems to me that there's a clear difference between showing a Black figure very small in the background being overlapped by others, and standing in the foreground very prominently larger than others. Prominence, if you might prefer, other than dignity, but certainly a sense of visual importance, which would be commensurate with his status. That was what I was trying to convey.
I mean, I quite agree with you, and I think all the 15th century codes for status are certainly there. I suppose my question comes more from that we're so used to thinking about exoticization through kind of 19th century orientalization, right? And therefore that it is a process of making something consumable for the West, and it has a very, very different, the process of exoticizing is a very different effect from dignifying. And so it's whether or not we can get beyond that view to what this process of exoticization might be doing. So we have more questions coming through. I have Laura Jacobus had a question to follow up on the gesture, which she wanted to say in person. Can we unmute her, please?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Yeah. Okay. Yes, actually, and connecting with the point that Scott's just made as well. On gesture, it seems to me that in both cases, there seem to be significant gestures for both of your paintings. There seem to be significant gestures. So in the Adoration of the Magi, the Black man seems to be pointing out of the frame. So, I mean, he could be pointing to his sleeve, but or else out of the frame. I don't suspect we're going to be able to answer that one, but the one in the Strozzi Chapel, that gesture does have a history. Certainly in earlier painting, it would be used as a gesture of grief. So you'll see very often, you'll see St. John the Evangelist at the crucifixion making that gesture. And you'll see it in Giotto's Arena Chapel with either Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, I can't remember, they're making that gesture. If it's still understood as a gesture of grief in the later 15th century, then it's hard to square with the potential convert eunuch thing, I suspect, because it would place him on the wrong side. He'd be grieving for the son, but perhaps you have a comment on that.
Well, as far as we're looking for other examples of that gesture, and thank you, both you and Guido, for that, pointing me in that direction. Certainly, the hand gesture would have to be seen in the context of the entire figure, and whereas when Giotto shows that gesture, the whole figure, every aspect from the face and the shoulders, all express grief. Seems to me, and any others who have looked and commented on this work, that nothing in this figure seems to show grief. So
I would say the expression shows consternation.
Yeah, yes, I would agree with that. So I will look into that. I'm not convinced that he shows grief, but I am convinced that it's important to look at his gesture.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the adoration, and the pointing gesture, I'm not sure if it's relevant, but in the painting right next to it at the Uffizi, it's the Pier di Cosimo Perseus, and in that painting there's an Ethiopian musician, so maybe there's a little dialogue across the paintings.
That's nice.
Do you have any further you want to say, Laura, or can we move?
I think you're making the point about decorum and whether an exoticized figure can also be conceived of as decorous in some ways. And I'm inclined to think, to go with you on that, that's particularly with Filippino Lippi, who just loves exoticizing everything and doesn't seem to me to have too much regard for decorum, but I'm sure other people will correct me on that. But it seems to me that he is quite decorative. His costume, although it's got these elements of real costume in it, is also highly fantasized. And so I do think there is that tension there. I don't know if that's the point you were making, but just seems to me that it's difficult to be dignified and be decorative.
Thank you very much. I've got two more raised hands. So the first one is from Paul Hills. So if we could unmute him.
Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan, for a fascinating paper. I again wanted to ask you about the Adoration of the Magi. Should we deduce from what you said that between Leonardo trying to paint the picture in 1481 and Filippino in 1496, that the Augustinians of San Donato, that they had new views, perhaps during the period of Sixtus, that caused them to, as you seem to suggest, to prompt Filipino to include the references to the Ethiopians.
Nice to hear your voice, Paul. And yes, I certainly feel that, let's start on more solid ground. The Leonardo's unfinished painting and his drawings show no sign of portraits. So the Augustinian canons must have asked Filipino to include the portraits. He wouldn't include, political portraits like that without being asked to. So that certainly indicates a change in the commission a dozen years later, 15 years later. But building on that, I think that yes, we see also a difference in the views of the Augustinians. I'm glad that you brought that up. It's an important point because it would indicate a shift in interest in the latter part of the century, which is actually what I've been trying to argue all along. But this would be another important evidence for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have another raised hand from Giorgia Brigatti. Could we unmute her?
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Thank you very much for your paper. It was very fascinating. I wanted to ask about if it's possible for you to see any connection between the representation of Ethiopians and the tradition of the Madonna Nera, the Black Madonna in Italy, a little bit earlier than that. And then I had just a basic curiosity about the language of communications between Ethiopians and Italians. If you can say something more about that, thanks.
So it'd be easy to be brief on both parts of your question. So I don't see any connection with the Black Madonna, except to say that it cautions us to make the immediate association between black and evil, as many modern observers often assume that if there's a black figure, it must be negative. And these Black Madonnas indicate another level of complexity to that. The language, that's a complex question, and it's been brilliantly discussed by Samantha Kelly, the historian who I briefly mentioned, who gave me much assistance in this paper. And basically, there were two levels of, they had double interpreters going on. So it's not quite clear how much was understood between the Ethiopians speaking to their interpreters, who then are being translated into Latin. So there's good reason to believe that there was a high degree of miscommunication when these embassies came to Italy. And one particular example is we're told that the Ethiopians agreed with the story about Prester John. Of course, it's hard to believe that they actually did that. So exactly what they were agreeing to, it's hard to know.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming through the chat, and I'm afraid we're probably not going to be able to get to all of them. I'm going to try and alternate some of the questions, but people have got raised hands. So Jacopo Nishi asks, could you say something about the difference of the costumes of the presumed Ethiopians between the Lippi panel and the costumes of the presumed Ethiopians in the Sistine Chapel?
Yes, important question. And it goes back to the idea of Filipino being interested in the exotic. So in both cases, we wouldn't say that they're wearing traditional Ethiopian garb. In both cases, they are wearing a Ethiopian element, this white shawl, which Ethiopian scholars, and I've contacted a number of them, and they all look at the painting and say, yes, the Filipino, at least, many of them have confirmed that it absolutely must be the Sama. So basically, what both artists do is taking clothes from different traditions or inventing them, or in the case of the Filipino, adding a Mamluk hat, but including an Ethiopian element. One could discuss why he did that, whether it's just to make it look more exotic, or, as I'm arguing, that in both cases, he actually wanted to signify to his viewers that this is an Ethiopian. But I'm only referring to the shawl.
Okay. Suzanne Babai has a question, so can we unmute Suzanne?
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
A voice from your past. Thank you.
Many years.
Thank you very much for your really interesting talk. It's out of curiosity I'm asking this. Much of what you reference does not really take into consideration the fact that the Muslim world was a whole lot more colorful than the Christian world was, and that embassies or groups of merchants who made it to various cities in Italy, and in particular in the Veneto region, were a whole lot mixed in terms of ethnicities and costumes and languages and so forth. And in addition, access to the Ottoman world would very clearly indicate how diverse the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa, but also sub-Saharan Africa were. So many of the people that are depicted in these paintings could very well pass as integrated into a broader, say, Mamluk society, an Egyptian, Syrian society, or an Ottoman society. And I wonder, my question really is, do you think there is a competitive edge here in terms of a kind of a global Florence, perhaps, or representation of a global Renaissance as we so desire these days to see?
Certainly, I'm glad that you brought our attention to something which I just mentioned in passing. But yes, the Florentines, and especially the Venetians, but also the Florentines, were in contact with many visitors from the East and from Ottoman, but also, as I mentioned, the Mamluks, all the the pilgrims, which I didn't say this, but they almost all of them came through Jerusalem, and therefore bringing together, often they would travel with others. So there would be a great mix of figures who were in different costumes and traditions. And this rich, colorful scene, which you indicated, certainly is important. And for someone like Filipino, who's interested, and not only Filipino, in showing the colorful, the exotic, it must have been very exciting and almost bewildering seeing these embassies. When Filipino was in Rome, there was also the Sultan's brother, I believe, who was a prisoner there. So there was Mamluk presence there. Whether this was a desire for Florence to show themselves as being international, that I'm not so sure about, but it's I would say it rather differently. I mean, the Florentines knew that they were international. I mean, Florence had the reason why they received the Mamluk embassies because they established a trading agreement with the Mamluks in 87, and the reason why there was another embassy in 97 was for the very same reason. So they were in contact with, especially the merchants, were in contact trading goods across the East, and the paintings reflect that. So I wouldn't see it so much as in the terms of competition, but rather as a reflection of the international status that Florence did have at the time.
Thank you. Jonathan, there are lots more questions. How are you feeling? Are you happy to answer a few more, or would you like us to?
I'm fine. Yeah.
Fine. Okay, so we have, I might put two together. Joy asks, one question, could individuals depicted that are considered possibly North African be of mixed race parentage? And then she mentions Alessandro de' Medici as a famous example. Somebody else further on down also asks, saying, I'm not reading fast enough, saying what caught my attention is the use of the word Moor during the talk. Usually the word indicates either skin color of a Muslim is from North Africa. Do you think paintings provide a better explanation of the word to define the ethnicity, particularly linked to this word? I think the question is about whether or not the paintings could give us a different kind of way of thinking about ethnicity, if I've understood it correctly. But if you want to think about those two questions, or have anything to say on those.
Yes. So Vasari, when describing the Adoration of the Magi, refers to Moors and Indians. And that got me thinking. So I just did a quick search to see where else does he refer to Moors or Indians. And I believe there are 4 other examples. And in each case, they're in pairs. It's either, whenever he talks about Moors, he says Moors and Indians. In one case, he says Moors and Gypsies. And in a couple of cases, such as the painting that I showed by Vasari himself, we clearly see a sub-Saharan African, who doesn't look like a Moor at all, although Vasari, describing his own work, called it a Moor. Similarly, there is a painting by Rosso Fiorentino, a Assumption of Christ, Ascension of Christ, in Città di Castello, where there's an extremely, extremely dark figure, who again, Vasari calls Moor. So I think what's going on here, and this is an important point addressing what both of you have said, and also the question of exoticism that came up before. My sense, and that of others I've spoken with, is that for Vasari and many others, the term Moor was sort of a generic term, like those dark-skinned people from down there. And remember that the Indians, as the other term that he used and that I discuss as well, people called Ethiopians Indians. And they seem to be, on the one hand, a very, for many people who, except for the travelers, a very imprecise sense of geography. But moreover, there was no great desire, or they didn't see a need, which we see, but they didn't see a great need to distinguish between Moors and Ethiopians and Indians. What was important was that they're from far away, that they had dark skin, and that they were Christian.
We have another raised hand from Michael Ohajuru. I hope I pronounced your surname correctly. Could we unmute him? Yes. You're still muted. Can you be unmuted? Ah.
Hello?
Michael?
You're live.
You're live. We can't hear you, unfortunately. Well, I noticed he did write a question in the chat, so I'll read the question out, assuming that's what he wanted to ask, in the hope that it is, and hopefully we'll get him on in a second. He says, what difference, if anything, do you see in the German interpretation of the Black Magus by such artists as Memling and Italian artists?
Certainly, well, in short, I could say Paul Kaplan wrote a wonderful book, focusing mainly on Northern European examples, but in the Northern European examples as well, there's a great interest in showing the sense of luxury and exotic, and the very often of the three kings, the one that has the richest clothes, that has furs, that has jewels, often rather extravagant behavior as well, is often the youngest king, and it's often the Black king. So this interest in exoticism and this luxury is seen as well, and I say even more so in Northern examples.
Okay. I think we'll take the final two questions, and then we'll release you from this evening. The first comes from Yves Strassman Flancer, so I presume from in Washington, asking, are you pursuing archival research in Florence to supplement this research? The donor figure in the so-called Davide Ghirlandaio is likely to shift our understanding massively of it. She says the lens of storytelling might be able to shift from such identification or the location of other specific individuals who can narrate those stories. So yes, a question about whether or not there's more archival work to be done.
Well, I mean, we'd all be thrilled if someone could figure out who the donor was for that Ghirlandaio altarpiece. But no, I'm not doing archival work on that, and I hope that someone finds more information on it.
I must have, in terms of the archive, I would personally just like to know about the number of pilgrims that we're dealing with.
Oh.
I mean, to me, that would be something that would really be helpful, because I mean, that would answer to again, the masculinization of it. I mean, we know about the embassies, but the actual just pilgrims, what one might imagine as ordinary pilgrims, I would really like to know more about that. We also have a question here. Where was it?
Let me just say there's a scholar named Benjamin Weber. I'm not sure if that's how he pronounces it. I think he's French. He publishes in French. And he's written a great deal on the Ethiopian pilgrims.
Okay. We have a question from Elizabeth Curry, which will take us the last one. What do you think about the combination of authenticity and invention in the clothing? Is the jewelry in the Zamt entirely Lippi's addition? What does it say about Florentine artists' perception of Ethiopians, if they're playing fast and loose, so to speak, with sartorial tradition of people from other countries?
So I think that Filipino certainly must have seen the Sama, probably on a pilgrim, also in Botticelli's painting, and then he decided to include it in his work. I think that's certain. Likewise for the Zamt, he could well have seen that in person, perhaps in a Mamluk embassy. Also the horned turban, he might have heard about that. So in part, he's looking at actual elements, but also he's adding his own fantasy, his own imagination. So the jewels on these, I think that this reflects something I just briefly mentioned, but there was a long tradition of associating Africa with gold, fair enough. Poggio Bracciolini, he wrote a text about Ethiopia, which was republished in 1492, so just before this painting came out. And he says that Ethiopian men wear a great many rings. The Filipino doesn't show rings on his hand, but he does show rings in the ear. So I think that there's no doubt, Filipinos didn't have to read Poggio to get this information. Rather, there's a widespread view on the wealth of Africans, and Filipino, both because of his interest in showing a prominent figure. My argument is that he wants to show a treasurer, a court official, would cover him with gold. I mean, in the entire chapel, this figure has more gold and jewels than anyone else. So if Filipino just had this interest in the exotic, why not use it for other figures? I think there's a particular reason why he did it here. So on the one hand, it's his imagination, but it's not simply choosing any old figure. I think there's a specific reason why he added jewels to this figure, because he wanted to show that it was a high court official and a treasurer.
On that note, thank you very much. I want to thank also all the questions that have come through on the chat and the audience. I realize that we haven't been able to get to all of them, and I apologize for that. I also recognize that there are a lot of suggestions in there for Jonathan, and we will save them and they will be passed on. So thank you very much for making them. But it remains also for me to thank Jonathan for such an enormously enriching and stimulating talk. Unfortunately, the nature of Zoom is such that you can't get a roaring applause, but you're going to have to imagine it. Thank you very much, and thank you. Do join us again online for future papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.